with a knife video for you. And today I want to talk about blade steel and about what makes blade steel good. This came out of a conversation on Instagram where I had a bit of a discussion and I accused someone of oversimplifying the issue. And I often think that's what's happened. And especially that's what happens with the Rockwell hardness stuff. It's not so simple as to just say, lower Rockwell hardness equals, less edge retention or poorer steel, and higher Rockwell hardness equals better edge retention slash better performing steel. It's much more complicated than that. And I know I'm going to get some flack for saying that because the fact is, we as humans like everything to be simple, right? Look at politics. No one, when you're in the political realm, talks about the nuanced elements of an issue. They just throw slogans back and forth at each other because generally people are idiots. And we who are into knives are idiots as well. And I'm including myself in that. Look, I like a simple slogan as much as the next guy. I like to oversimplify issues as much as anyone, but I really, really try not to do that. I try not to do it on this channel. I try not to do it when I'm in my day job, which is a minister. And so the fact is, some issues are a little more complex than we like to admit. And it's not as simple as just reading the thing and saying, hey, this has M390 steel, it's going to be awesome. It's not as simple as saying, hey, this is hardened to 62 or 65 Rockwell, it's going to be awesome. There's more to this discussion than that. And so I want to talk with you guys a little bit about what makes a good blade steel. And I'd love to hear your comments down below along those lines as well. So the first thing that we have to point out is, we're going to narrow it down a little bit in a second, but the first thing we have to say is it depends on what you're trying to achieve. Okay, so depending on whether you're doing a heavy duty sort of tactical style knife, or whether you're doing sort of a lightweight EDC style knife, or something else, maybe more of a utility tool, whatever the case may be, depending on what you're trying to achieve with that knife. And of course, we could include like axes, and we could include hatchets and large chopping survival style knives in spring steel versus more refined steels. And that debate has happened, by the way. When Survive Knives uses, I think they use like 20 CV, well, Tops Knives uses 1095. Okay, so which is better? And so the first thing that we have to think about is, what are you trying to achieve with this knife? What's it going to be doing? Okay. And well, there's a huge spectrum. And of course, there's lots of knife makers out there and lots of forums where you can find those discussions of makers who will share with you, hey, I chose this steel because this is what I was trying to achieve with this knife. And that's great. And I encourage everyone to spend some time, whether it be reading forums or listening to, makers discussions and videos or whatever the case may be, to try and see what's going through the mind of a knife maker when they decide what steel they want to go with. And by the way, we have to add one other element here, and that is what's going through the mind of a company. All right, because if you're just a knife maker and you're making one or two knives, or you're making individual knives for individual clients, that's a completely different animal than, I don't know, Cold Steel trying to make a knife that everyone is going to want. Okay, they want to sell lots of these. And so we as consumers have to realize that part of choosing steel and telling us about steel is a sales pitch. Right. So never forget, these companies, they want you to buy their knives. And so they're selling you whenever you start reading about product descriptions or performance or anything like that. It's sales. Okay. They're trying to get you to buy whatever new great thing that they've come up with. And so a big part of choosing a steel for a manufacturer, it has nothing to do with performance. They could care less. They only care about what consumers want to see on that piece of paper. And if everyone wants to see M390, you're going to see a bunch of knives in M390. And if everyone wants to see whatever Rockwell hardness number, you're going to see those numbers, even if it's maybe not the best choice for whatever it is you're doing. Okay, so let's put that out there as well. And now let's get back to real knife users and what we think, and some of my views on how I kind of work through picking whether or not I think a steel is any good or not, and some of the things that I try to bring to bear when I'm, say, making a YouTube video and telling you guys whether a knife has good steel or bad steel. All right, so I'm just going to kind of keep switching things up a little bit as we work our way through here. don't want you guys to get too bored watching this video because there will be a bit of, it's a discussion video, so I'm not featuring in great detail any of these knives. Okay, so the first thing, let's narrow it down to folder. So I'm going out to buy a folding knife. I want to figure out what steel is best. And so what do I care about most in a folding knife? Well, probably you care about edge retention. I mean, I do. I don't know. Maybe some of you watching could care less about edge retention. And if that's you, hey, that's fine. But I care a little about edge retention. We care about toughness. So that is, I don't want this edge that's going to hold for a super long time. But as soon as I, try to cut a piece of cardboard, it's going to break because the steel is so brittle. I don't want it to chip or roll. Okay. I don't want, I want a steel that's going to be tough and durable that I'm going to be able to use for prolonged periods of time. And so that can be a difficult balance to strike. Okay. But also, generally speaking, we don't want it to rust. And that means different things for different people. Some people like to put a patina on their blade, so they like to use non-stainless steels. Other people live in an environment that's just extremely high humidity. If you live on the ocean or in the swamps of Louisiana or something, yeah, you're probably very concerned about how rust resistant this is. All right, the other thing we have to think about when we talk about all these characteristics, okay, so basically, yeah, I don't want it to rust, I want it to hold an edge, I don't want it to be too fragile. Once I've kind of got those things down, then we have to realize that you can maximize some of those things and sacrifice others. So maybe you're making something for the Spyderco Salt series and you're going to use the H9 steel or the LC200N. Well, now by the way, LC200N seems to have a pretty good edge retention, but you're not going to get the same edge retention as some of the really, really crazy steels that are meant for no other reason than to hold an edge, and they maybe even don't even care how stainless they are. All right, so just realize again that some steels purposely go out of the way, or some companies purposely go out of the way to maximize one aspect of this. Okay. And so we need to kind of keep that in the back of our minds as one of the things that will happen. Okay, so, all right, I've got a steel that, will hold an edge almost forever, right? This thing, I mean, once it's sharp, forget about it. There's no way that it's going to dull. And that's fantastic. So I can use the knife until it finally does dull, because the fact is every knife is eventually going to get dull. And now what am I going to do? Because many times, not all the time, but many times, a steel that holds an edge like crazy is fantastic until you go to sharpen it, because it's so abrasion resistant that it even resists you trying to remove material to create a new edge. Okay, so we've got to consider that as well. And of course, if all we ever cared about is edge retention, I suppose you'd see an awful lot of ceramic blades out there, but we really don't see a lot of ceramic because one, they're nearly impossible to resharpen after they do eventually dull, and two, they're fragile, so you can break them off pretty easily. All right. The other thing that we have to think about, and this is somewhat anecdotal and somewhat experiential for sure, okay? Some steels tend to act better than they should, okay? And I'll give you one example. I find CTS XHP holds an edge better than S35VN, and I think others have found that same thing to be true. But I also find CTS XHP very easy to sharpen. I've never had a hard time getting an edge on it. In fact, it's as easy or maybe easier to sharpen than S35VN, and yet it holds an edge better. Okay, the same thing, the same experience I've had with 14C28N versus VG10. In terms of cutting performance, and longevity of that edge in terms of its performance, I found 14C28N to hold an edge really, really well and be easily comparable to VG10. And yet, when you go to sharpen them, it's not the same experience. I definitely find that 14C28N, like what we've got on this Real Steel Griffin, is easier to deal with in sharpening than VG10. All right, so we care about that as well. I don't know about you, but I assume that I'm going to have to sharpen my knives. And by the way, one of the things that, it doesn't really, I mean, it kind of comes into this video. And one of the things I'm going to recommend is you get good at sharpening. You take the time to learn that skill and sharpen your own knives and sharpen your own knives really, really well. Okay. And the reason for that is you'll gain your own experience about how steel performs, and you'll understand when it's a really hard steel what challenges that presents for you to get an edge on it. And you'll understand when knife makers, Chris Reeve always gets flack about how soft the S35 VN is in his knives, and he always says I try to design it so that my customers can sharpen their knives, and certainly, I get that. Now, I will say this: you have this challenge, and you see, by the way, this challenge in a number of different areas. Knife companies, all right, they're selling knives, and they don't want to sell them just to knife enthusiasts. Okay, they want to sell them to every average Joe Blow on the street, and that presents a challenge because every average Joe Blow on the street may not be able to sharpen a knife very well. And that's going to create a real problem for a company if they're selling knives with super hard steel. Yeah, it'll hold an edge like crazy, but forget about ever sharpening. You're going to have to send it away every time. Well, that's going to put off a lot of end users who aren't like us, right? Who aren't like the people watching this video, who are super into it. All right. And then the other thing we haven't brought up yet is what about cost? Okay, I suppose we could, let's say we just went out there and I mean Cedar Canada Gear and Outdoors. So Pete over there has done a great job of testing steels and listing, and he's got multiple sort of steel roundup, I think he calls them, videos, and I'll put a link to one in the description down below. His most recent one is really, really good. But he's got lots of videos where he just talks about how all these different steels perform and kind of lines them up in his categories of, totally awesome to, acceptable, but not so great. And it's a really, really helpful video. But why not then? Okay, so Pete's done the work. He's told us kind of what steel is the best. Why don't we just scrap all the steels and make all the knives in that one steel that is really high end and really high performance, right? Then every knife has great steel in it, and it's going to work really, really well for everything, right? Um, so what are you going to do then, right? Is that a choice that we want to make? And I think most of us would say, no, I like the possibility of getting, a knife made in D2 so that it doesn't cost me so much, or 14C28N or S30V or S35, and we sort of climb up the ladder. There's lots of price points on steels, and we want, I think, as customers, that ability to pick a little bit. Maybe I don't need M390 for every single knife in my collection, right? Now, I know some people will. And I know some of you have commented on my videos, I never buy a knife in, steel lower than whatever. And maybe it's S30V, maybe it's S35VN, maybe it's M390, whatever the case may be. I have had a lot of you say, nope, I only use a steel with this kind of performance because, I dull knives really, really quickly and I can't spend all of my time sharpening them. And I get that. Now, I dare say for most people, all right, pursuing that super crazy edge retention is purely an academic exercise. Most of us, right, if I'm honest, I could easily make do with HCR 13 MOV in my daily cutting tasks, right? I could. Yeah, I'd have to stop and sharpen my knife every maybe 3 days or something. But I mean, I could do that, right? That's not completely out of the question. And so I don't really need S35VN or M390 or 20CV or any of the above, higher end crazy steels. But I like them, okay? I do. We all like to, it's sort of like driving a car. Do you need a car that can do 200 miles an hour? Well, no one does, right? Not if you're driving it on the road. We really only need a car that can hit about 70 and we're good to go. But you like to have a car that has 500 horsepower and can really take off, right? But no one needs that. All right, so all we want is a steel that doesn't cost a whole lot, that holds an edge really long, that won't rust, that's easy to sharpen, that won't break, chip, or roll. And, why can't the knife industry just give us that? And to some degree, they can. There are lots of steels that meet a lot of those criteria and do a pretty decent job of it. But most of the time, we're going to make some sacrifices. So we don't want a steel that rusts. And yet, we know that D2 is going to give us really nice performance at a really budget price point. So most of us, and if you guys are like me, I have lots of D2 knives, and I really like D2. And in fact, I rarely have any problems. It's not just the most what would you say, prone to rust steel that's out there. All right, it's actually got some chromium in it, and it will, be okay unless you're getting it wet all the time and not taking care of it. And I take care of my knives pretty well. All right, but most of us, I think, want there to be a D2, right? We don't want to be like, hey, let's never make knives out of again because it doesn't meet one of our criteria. All right, the fact is we choose a balance between what we can tolerate and what we want because, cost is a thing. And by the way, one of the things we didn't touch on in terms of cost is that when it comes to cost of a knife steel, in addition to just the cost of buying steel ingots. So if I'm, an individual knife maker, and I'm making custom knives and I'm buying, you know, blade stock, well, that's one thing. All right. But the fact is most of us are into production knives and production companies are going to buy large quantities of steel. And because of that, they're going to be able to buy it at a lower price, a much lower price than like a real custom knife maker who's buying, a bit of steel every year. But you have to keep in mind that the steel cost is not the only thing involved. With harder steels and higher performance steels, they can be anyway, harder to heat treat, take longer to heat treat, be more labor intensive to heat treat, and they can also be harder to grind, more labor intensive to grind. And so all of that cost, if I've got to pay people by the hour, then I've got to consider how many hours I'm going to be spending, getting that blade to the kind of performance that I want from it. Okay, so now that we've kind of got all of those factors considered and we've kind of hit on most of the points that we're going to care about when it comes to steel, there's still some other things that matter. All right, so if we narrow it down to as I was saying, we've narrowed it down to, here's the kind of things we like. We understand that there's some balances to be struck here, but guess what? There's still more to say about this because even if we got the best steel with the best heat treat, we can totally mess it up if it's poorly ground and if it has, a super bad edge geometry that won't get into material very easily. So poorly treated steel that's, M390 or 20 CV with a poor heat treat might still suck. Okay. Now it might still perform better than ACR13 MOV. All right. But it may not be all that we can get out of it. The other thing is poorly ground. Let's say we've got the heat treat right on point and it's the greatest steel out there. But the grind is really, really bad. So it's super thick behind the edge or it's a really steep angle of attack. So, let's imagine, I don't know, you can pick any of these knives. But if let's say you took this knife and moved the grind down to like here and then put a super steep angle on it, well, that knife is going to have a hard time performing the way you want it to because you're creating a huge amount of wedge effect where instead of slicing through material, now you're just going to break it open. All right. And that's going to take more force delivered by your hand, pushing it into the material. So now you've got a knife that maybe it has the best steel ever, but if it's got a super obtuse grind and a super obtuse primary and secondary bevel, you could have a real disaster and it just won't cut well. All right. By the way, thinking of all of this, there's an important thing. I'll give you one little personal preference here. I really like the versatility and the, you know, sort of nuance that comes from two grinds, not standard. I really like a convex grind and I really like a hollow grind, which you could also call a concave grind, but we don't. We call it a hollow grind. Those are the two best I feel like because one, if I really want to go for toughness, then a flat grind only partially gets there. If I really want a tough, durable blade, then a convex grind is going to be the way to go. And it's really going to deliver that toughness. And then if I want a knife that sacrifices some toughness for slicing power, for cutting power, then I want a hollow grind because you can deliver a really tough, really durable blade and still get it thin behind the edge and still make it slice like crazy by going with that hollow grind. So those are the two grinds that I like the best. I think flat grind is sort of, it takes the worst of both worlds. All right. And I have lots of flat ground blades that I like. In fact, this is one of my favorite knives of the year. It's a flat grind. It's not that I dislike a flat grind. I just would almost always rather have either a hollow grind or a convex grind. Now, the other thing we have to talk about here is that Pete has demonstrated really well how much difference that grind makes. And I wanted to bring him up because he's done a lot of work on this. And I am going to put a link to his steel roundup video, but I also would recommend you go to his channel and look at some of the videos where he tries to get the very most out of a steel. And what that almost always involves is laying this secondary bevel right there at the end of my thumb, laying that back as much as possible and going to a really, really high angle. And even like on OS 8, he did it with a Rat Model 1 and found that OS 8 performed way better with that really, really high angle. So virtually every steel that he's tested has demonstrated that it does better in that super steep secondary bevel, which is really kind of cool and something you may want to consider doing to your own knives. All right, so now we've kind of, I think, covered most of the important factors that go into figuring out whether this steel is good or not good. All right, and yes, there's a lot of things to consider here. And, yeah, I think YouTubers like me have been part of the problem here rather than part of the solution, right? Because when I review a knife, I often talk about the steel, but I don't spend a huge amount of time on it, right? I'm generally going to say something like, hey, this has got S30V steel or this has got M390 steel, and that's a good steel, right? It's going to do well for you. I'm not going to get into hardness and chemistry. And it's just, one, I want people to actually watch my videos, and that would become so painfully boring that all of you would click off. But then we have oversimplified the issue so that every once in a while I need to make a video like this just to remind everyone, hey, when I say this is a good steel, there's a lot of things that I'm considering, but I can't go over them over and over again in every single video. So what do we want from a good steel? We want it to hold an edge. We want it to hold an edge long enough for our purposes. Okay, and that's important to consider. If you only pull your knife out 3 or 4 times a week to cut something, you don't need a crazy edge retention on your steel, right? And that's the fact. That's true for most of us. Even if you pull it out once or twice a day, you don't need crazy good edge retention. I don't want it to break under my conditions. So my conditions are cutting stuff like this. All right, I don't jam this in and start prying on stuff, even though I kind of like to have that ability. But there's a chance that I might stab this into something or that I might carve with the end of it a little bit, and I want it to be able to do that without me having to worry. All right, I may do some of this type of stuff where I cut and push, and I want to be able to do that. I don't want to be worried that my knife is going to break all the time. But I can tell you what I'm not going to do is, start taking this and batoning it into a piece of wood and start wedging the wood out like that. I'm not going to do that because I just don't think a knife is the best tool for that kind of job. All right, and I don't want it to rust, again, in my use and my area. So if I'm a scuba diver, that's going to mean something way different than if I'm just a regular person. If I'm a firefighter, okay, so the knife that I carry, if I'm going to be on a scene or if I'm going to fire training, has got to be a little different because often, okay, number one, I'm going to end up wet. Number two, I'm going to end up sweating like crazy. So that knife that's sitting in my pocket, even a knife that's pretty rust resistant, that can, I can get a knife to show some signs of rust because it's just so much moisture, right? Not only are there fire hoses, but, I may have to jump into a porta tank and pull something out. I may have to, who knows what I'm going to be doing on any given day, but I do know that most of the time there's going to be a lot of water around in addition to my own sweat because I'm wearing a snowsuit, okay? So, for those conditions, I avoid certain knives, right? I'm not going to take my Rat Model 1 and D2 to most fire calls, right, or to fire training. I'd be more inclined to take something in a more rust-resistant steel. All right, now, having given all of those main points, I want to say this. Lots and lots of steels, not most, but lots and lots of steels can achieve all those 3 main points that we're looking for. All right. And again, I'm going to defer to Pete. If you want a full breakdown and discussion of every steel that's out there, go over and watch one of his steel roundup videos. He's got a couple. I'll find the most recent one and put it in the comments here. But I will give you this one thing. There are steels that I like, and I'll just give you a quick sort of rundown. Okay, so in budget knives, I like to see 14C28N or I like to see D2. Right, those are my favorite. 9CR18 MOV is also pretty good. Lots of people have compared it to VG10, and so you've got to give it some credit as well. So those are the steels. Those 3 are kind of at the bottom of the list. I like to see those in budget knives. In middle of the road knives, I like to see, S30V, like to see S35VN, M390, 20CV. Those knives, those steels can be found in lots and lots of knives that are between 150 and 250. Okay. And then for the higher end stuff, it's nice to see something a little rarer, maybe S90V or 189 ZDP or I mean ZDP 189 or Van X or something like that that maybe you don't see every day. I don't really care. I don't feel like I have to have those steels, but again, they're nice to see in something that's kind of special. It's nice to have a steel that's kind of special as well, even though, I'm not suggesting that you necessarily need that performance or that they perform better than everything else that's along those lines. All right, so there you go, guys. That's my steel discussion. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'd love to hear your favorite steels. I'd love to hear the considerations that you give to all of those different factors that we've discussed and how you like to see them balance out, because there is a balance that has to be struck here. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Don't forget to use I'll put a link down to DLT Trading, my affiliate link. I think most of the knives I've shown you here are available over there, so go ahead, use that link. It does help the channel out an awful lot. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you soon.